Today on the Awesome Marriage Podcast, we are talking about how to put love in action in your marriage. It's safe to assume you love your spouse, even if they drive you crazy sometimes. But how well do you put your love into action in a way that speaks to them? Today, we'll give some practical ways to do this in your everyday life. So, Dr. Kim, it's Valentine's Day, and this is the time that a lot of us think about demonstrating love. But why do we need to make love a verb in our marriage? Why isn't it enough to say, I love you?
Well, I do think love is an action word. And so, like, if I tell Nancy that I love her, but my actions tell a different story, what is she going to believe? She's going to believe my actions. If I'm sitting there telling her I love
Mm,
her, but then I'm just being grumpy or I'm being unkind or I'm not paying attention to her, I'm not listening to her, she's going to believe what she sees and because that's going
mm,
to give the emotion to her. And so, if I tell her I love her, I need to back that up with the way I treat her, the way I talk to her, what I do for her, all those kind of things and I'm never going to be perfect, but as best I can to not only tell her I love her, but to show her I love her.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point because our words, are kind of express like our best intent, but our actions, you can't really fake those.
No, no, and I think,
Which,
just in
yeah.
basic communication, we know that our actual words really are only 7% of the message, and the rest of it is our tone of voice and our body language. That's really what, when I have a couple come into counseling and one will say, you said this, and the other say, I won't, I didn't say it. Yes, you did. I didn't. Well, it's
Mm,
probably because everything either matched up or didn't match up. And so
mm-hmm,
what the person said those words might not have been heard by their spouse because of
mm-hmm.
the body language, because of the tone of voice. And so I think we have to realize how important all those are. And if our spouse is really going to believe when we say, I love you, all that's got to match up.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And that's just talking about the conversational side. I mean, I love that stat about the 7%. That is a wild number that how low
I
that
know.
is of the actual words. But then outside of the conversation or outside of talking, everything else we're doing is communicating something as well.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point that we don't have to be speaking something to communicate. If
Hmm.
I tell Nancy I love her in the morning and the rest of the day, I don't say anything to her, but it's like I'm being selfish or whatever. She's gonna at the end of the day, is she gonna feel love? No, just because I said it at the first of the day, probably not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and then if you come home and you're ready to get cozy, it might not be the the warm reaction that
No,
you wanted to have.
right, exactly.
Well, so if a listener wants to get started with making love an action word, where would you say to start?
I really think I always go back to love language, but I really think it's just because it works. And
Hmm.
I've seen it with just every couple I've ever worked with that when they figure out their spouse's main love language or top two love languages, and start
Hmm.
loving them in that way, things are better. And so I think know what your spouse's love language is, and then how do they both best receive that? And the expert
Hmm.
on that is your spouse. And so it's
Hmm.
conversations. And so Nancy's is quality time and physical touch. So if I consistently tell her I love her, but I'm not spending time with her, she may not feel as loved. And there, I'm not really doing anything overt. I'm not being
Hmm.
mean. I'm not being unkind or something. But because it's her love language, she needs me spending that time with her. She needs me to be focused when I'm with her, those kind of things. And with physical touch, if I never rub her back or hold her hand or cuddle
Hmm.
with her, she's not going to feel as loved because those are the ways that she really feels connected and loved. And so I think you start with the love language and figure out your spouse. How do they best receive this? If it is quality time, well, what does that mean to your spouse? Because it might mean a
Hmm.
little bit different to you than it does to your spouse. And if it's physical touch, what does that mean to her or to him? And so
Hmm.
how do I best do that? And then you start doing those things. And those are going to be ways you can show love every single day to your spouse in a way that they're going to feel loved.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because, a lot of this stuff, I think what you said is, you might not be demonstrating love. You're not doing something mean. You're just not really taking that step to be intentional about what's going to communicate to them. And
Yes.
so, yeah, so I think it's important it's not just We want to avoid doing bad stuff. We also want to be intentional to do the stuff that's building in that love. And so, if a listener doesn't know what their spouse would like, you've kind of mentioned this, but what do they need to do if they just don't know the spouse's love language or what they like or don't like?
Well, I think it goes back to you do need to ask them, and
Hmm.
hopefully they will tell you. If they don't tell you, then you kinda got a little different problem
Yeah,
because,
right.
okay, why don't you want me to love you? So
Yeah.
hopefully they'll be able to do that. But I think so if you're the wife, and because women are usually more relational than their husbands, you may have to probe a little more with him. You may have to
Mm,
ask some questions, or you may say, "Okay, we did the love languages book. We know your love language is say words of affirmation. How does you best receive that?" And they may give you a blank stare. So maybe you give them a couple of suggestions. Well, when I when I know that you're doing a good job at work and everything, and I compliment you for that, does that help? If you're down on the floor playing with the kids and that just warms my heart, and I say
mm,
you're such a good dad, is give them some examples so you can kind of get a feel of what's going to really work for them. And so
mhm,
one of the things that I do this year that I'm really trying to make a habit is to ask Nancy every day what she needs from me.
mhm,
um, and so I can ask her, what do I do that makes you feel loved? Is there anything you'd like me to do to make you feel more loved? Just some of those questions. And I think for the spouse, is giving feedback. If Nancy does something that really
mhm.
makes me feel loved, it really helps her if I tell her. I said, "Gosh, that
Yeah.
really made me feel loved. Thank you for doing that," because that gives her feedback. And so then she knows, okay, this is something I know really helps him feel loved. And so when you're working, the ideal thing obviously is to be working on it together and to learn
Mhm.
about yourself. I mean, you'll find out some things about yourself and about your spouse in this process, which is kind of cool and kind of fun too. But I think just being consistent with it, be persevering in it, all those things I think really help.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And I'm so glad you brought up just keeping that conversation open and checking in, because I think that when I was early in marriage, I think we thought we should just know this stuff without having to ask. And I didn't even realize it at the time, but I was raised in a household with pretty intuitive communication, intuitive parents, and we would all just kind of, be on the lookout for those hints or whatever and not really communicate clearly. And if you bring that into marriage, you're probably going not get the results you want, because that's not everyone's way of operating. And so, and then you have stuff like you might have like, other people you've seen that seem to not have to talk about things or whatever. And that's not a realistic expectation in marriage.
Hmm.
And so I think it's really important that you bring that up, but also within the love languages to define, okay, so if your love language is acts of service, what does that mean to you? Is it taking out the trash, or is it something totally different, bringing you coffee, or,
Right.
you know, I think you really have to get that specific, because what we perceive as the application of the love language might not be what our spouse would receive as showing that love language.
Yes, and I think one thing that I've been seeing from couples lately, and I've kind of begun to see it in us a little bit, is sometimes I think over the course of a marriage, your love languages might change a little bit. That may not
Mhm.
mean that the one that you thought going into it is not still important, but you may have something else may have been important. When we first got married, Nancy would not have said one of hers is physical touch. She came from a home
Mhm.
that they just didn't touch much. They didn't hold hands, they didn't hug a lot, those kind of things. And so I came from a real touchy family, very much a lot
Mhm.
of hugging, a lot of connection that way. And so it was sometimes Nancy I'd hold her hand, and it was like I could just tell it was hard for her, and maybe if she'd make it a
Mhm.
minute, that was a big deal, and then she'd let go. Well, I think over the course of our marriage, now she would say that physical touch is one of her love languages, because she has learned to kind of get past the family of origin stuff and really embrace that and enjoy that, to where that's become a way that she really feels loved. If I'm able to, she loves me to rub her back and things like that. And so again, defining that, and asking her, okay, if physical touch has really become important to you, what makes you feel the most love? What physical
Mhm.
touch do you enjoy the most? Is it holding hands? Is it rubbing your back? Is it cuddling? Is it sitting next to each other? You know, what is that? how does that play out? And then it gives you so much information as a spouse to do those
Mhm.
things. And really, it's not very hard. You just kind of begin to make those things your
Yeah.
habit. You every day, how do I meet her love language? How do I meet his love language? What do I do to reinforce that? And if you do that consistently, you're going to see a difference for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so good. We in our marriage we learned, so Brian's big words of affirmation, and I'm not, that's not a big one for me. And so learning to do that when I would start trying to, put that into our relationship, it was something was off. Like it wasn't communicating, he still
Mm.
didn't feel those words of affirmation coming through. And so we had to go back and go, what's happening here? Because I think I'm doing this, but you're not receiving it. And it turned out just be timing. It was just timing issue. It needs to be
Interesting.
said, not like, in passing, but sort of more with intentionality. And that was just something that I felt like I was making this effort to, like, okay, I'm going to look for opportunities. I'm going to really take them and
Hmm.
affirm these things. And then why isn't it connecting? And it's so important and so helpful when you just learn that one small tweak to go, oh, that's all it took was just a little adjustment.
That's such a good point, Lindsay. And I think, and if so, if you've identified that and you're doing what you think and it doesn't work, then I don't keep doing the same thing that's not working, because their love
Mhm.
language is words of affirmation. Okay. Like you guys did, talk about it. Okay. Timing is a
Mhm.
big deal. Okay. Now I know that. Now I can do that in a way that's going to make him feel loved. So that's a great example.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and I think too, and I mean another example, because I love all those practical examples, and so I think one other thing I think of is, I think when you talked about the changing love languages, my one of mine did not used to be gifts, and I feel like now it is, and so Brian was like, "Oh man, what are we gonna do? The budget, and so I said,
Your
we
love
it's good
language
that
is going
we're
to break us.
yeah, exactly. Because, for me, I think of gifts as maybe a cup of coffee, or maybe a,
Yeah.
a chocolate bar that I love. Just very small things. It's really just the thought, but it's having that small, tangible thing. That was a change of love language, but also was not, oh, yeah, I'm going to need some jewelry every week. It's not that at all. It was just very
Right.
small things. And if we hadn't talked about that, that could have been very stressful.
Yeah, you better get a side job, Brian.
Yeah, right.
This is going to be expensive. Now,
Yeah.
I think that's like, it's funny. Last week, Nancy and I were talking about love languages, and she looked at me seriously, and she goes, "I think I have all of them now." And I go, "Oh, good. This is going to be great. What am I going to do?"
Oh, that's
Uh,
amazing.
yeah.
She's perfect now. She's got them all. Well, I
Yep.
I think if anyone is listening and they're just not familiar with the love languages or your spouses, we have some awesome resources to help with this. We have a
Mhm.
5 days, 5 ways love language challenge. We have a U version plan. And what I love about those is they're not just helping you find the love language, they give a lot of specific ways to speak to
Yeah.
every single love language. And we also have a resource called Love Cans, which is just an easy way to put in writing some simple things that your spouse can do that really connect with you and make you feel loved. So we'll put all of those links in the show notes because they're really practical, simple ways to go ahead and take some action on this in a way that your spouse will receive.
That's so great. Great
Yeah.
resources.
And yeah, and those are some super helpful practical things, some for free, some for donation. So, what if a listener has tried to do some things to show love, but they have not been well received? What do they do?
Well, don't give up, because you
Mm-hmm.
do want your spouse to feel love. That's going to do great things for your marriage. So there may be barriers there that you don't know about. I would say persevere. Maybe it would be helpful to involve a third person and go to counseling. If why can't your spouse receive that? Is it something from family of origin? Is it something that they're holding against you, or is it something that that is an issue that maybe they don't feel worthy? Well, that
Mm-hmm.
maybe they've never expressed that, and so it's hard for them to receive that. And so, my counsel on that would be to not give up, persevere, and take whatever steps are necessary to resolve that, because you want to be able to do the things that your spouse enjoys and receives. And maybe it's just that you're hitting the wrong buttons. Again, that goes back to the
Hmm.
communication. Okay, let's do it this way, and finding out what the barriers are, and how do we knock these barriers down.
Mm. Yeah, that's really good. I think that's so important because I think it's easy if you feel like you've been burned to just say, well, I tried. It didn't work.
Yep,
I'm done.
it is.
That
And I
didn't go
get it.
well.
And some of us, it we're sensitive, and
Hmm.
so if we take it as rejection, and we just back off. Well, I'm not gonna be rejected anymore. But in a
Hmm.
marriage, it's different. This isn't like somebody at work that you can say, "Hey, I'm just drawing a boundary here. I'll do my work, but I'm just not going to engage with that person." This is the person you committed to live the rest of your life with. So you got to work it out. You got to figure it out, especially if you guys really want the marriage God has for you.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it's really easy to kind of shut down in those places. But I think the first half of this conversation, we've talked about some great ways to go ahead and keep working through that and not to get stuck on those potential past, slip ups. And I think that that would be my encouragement. I have a really embarrassing story of Valentine's Day with Brian, where he knew that sometimes I don't like things that seem cookie cutter or seem like everyone has done it. So he didn't get me any roses on Valentine's Day, and that was fine. I wasn't expecting anything. Well, the next day he shows up with a dozen like yellow roses that to me, I'm like, this looks like something you take to the hospital. And so I'm like, you got me discount roses that look like hospital roses. And I didn't say that necessarily, but I was not very like receptive or responsive. And he was thinking, well, I knew I'd get you something a little different, a little bit of original. And it was such a miscommunication. And I don't think he even brought me flowers for quite a while after that because I did just, it was not a very good response. But we did talk it through eventually, and it was just one of those moments where he pictured coming in like all, "Oh, here I got you something that's just special like you," and I just like, you know, it was not a pretty picture.
He's gonna be Prince Charming. It's like you.
Right.
No, that didn't work.
Yeah.
That's right. So since you're a lady and I don't know
Yeah.
the answer to this, what's the difference with different colors of roses? Is there a significance for yellow, white, pink, red, or is it just what a woman likes? Or I've always shied away from yellow, and I don't know why, because I think they're pretty, but I've never, for some reason, in my mind, it's the same thing. That it's just like
Yeah. I
just
thought,
doesn't.
okay, these look like a hospital or your mother, but
Yeah,
I I think ideally we probably all have a favorite flower. We probably have a favorite color. And I think that every husband probably just needs to ask because I don't think that I don't know if there's any safe assumptions there. I think the best thing is knowing that your husband wants to know your specific favorites. I think that is what matters. And then he
very
remembers.
good, very good. I agree,
Yep.
because if there's a system there, no, I haven't found it anywhere, and so
Sure.
and obviously
I think
Brian hadn't either.
he had not. I think there's an actual code somewhere, but I don't know if anyone knows it, like an old
Yeah,
timey
yeah, exactly.
Victorian chart. Well, okay. So these are all really great tips to being active about our love. But what about actually saying the words, I love you? Is that also important?
I think it is. I mean, I think I like to hear it. I think Nancy likes to hear it. I don't, and
Hmm.
honestly, I don't think we say it a lot. And I
Hmm.
don't think I mean, I think some of it is out of habit now, but I think there's truth to it and there's emotion to it, even with that.
Hmm.
I don't think we can ever hear those words enough. I think we were made for love. We know that God is love. Now, for that to really penetrate, goes back to what we talked about earlier, that it's got
Hmm.
our actions and all those kind of things have to match up. But I think just, I know couples that don't ever say I love you. And maybe
Hmm.
that works for them. It probably wouldn't work for me. And I don't think it'd work for us, because
Hmm.
that's just a really important thing. It's just an affirmation, I guess, for us uh, of what it is. And even saying it when things are not the best, it's like, I may not like you right now, but I still love you,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and we'll work on the part that's keeping me from liking you. But right,
Yeah.
so I think there's a lot of value in it. Just that's my experience with it. And I just
Mhm.
think that I see couples that say it consistently. I would say those couples, there's just something special about that.
Hmm. Mhm. Yeah, I
What
think
are
it's
your thoughts?
valuable. Yeah, I think it's valuable. I don't think that I think that these things all go into a marriage because
Yeah,
you don't nothing stands alone. It's all like part of this ongoing continual relationship. And so I think we can look for any way we can to build into that. And I think that's a great thing to do.
I agree. Yeah. Now, I agree. If you're just saying it for a checklist,
Mhm.
yeah, I think there should be some sincerity behind it
Mhm.
to really be
Mhm.
received, to really make a difference.
Mhm. Yeah, and I
And
think
so I
that does
think,
come through.
yeah, and I think you just go back. God, help me to love her or him more. Help me
Mhm.
to what am I missing here? And just let God kind of guide you in that, because Jesus showed us love when he was here, and in powerful ways of how he cared for people. Cared them enough to do good things for them, to confront them, to lead them into something better. And
Mhm.
so, how do we love? And I think God has all
Mm.
those answers for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And his love too, it's not like a romantic nice warm fuzzy feelings love. It's like a lot deeper than that. There's a care, there's looking out for each other. And so I think in those moments where like you said it's not in the best moment, I think that's where we can go a little deeper and say, okay, God, you love me
Hmm.
perfectly, you love my spouse perfectly. Help me to have your unconditional love for them, not just the good feelings love.
Absolutely, that's good.
So I think we had a listener who recently wrote in and asked why her husband would not say, I love you. She said that in several years of marriage, he's only said it one or two times. So why would a spouse be that reluctant to say the words?
Well, I do think family of origin plays a big part in that. If you
Mhm.
came from a home where it never really was said and you really didn't hear your parents say it, probably didn't value it in the way that someone grew up. In my home, we said it all the time.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that was something that was a little harder for Nancy because it was said, but not in the same way, I think, or as much as is my home. And so as we I think, grew our love, it became much easier for that to be a part of our daily talking.
Mhm.
Um, so, maybe because of that, someone feels like they don't really need to hear it. And so they assume their spouse doesn't either. And so
Mhm.
sometimes it's a communication thing of not really knowing how important that could be to your spouse, or what it could be like if you began to do that, even if you didn't grow up with that. And
Mhm.
so, if some people, I think it is the hard words to get out. I mean, I think I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I remember leading up to telling Nancy I loved her for the first time when we were in college. It was like, I opened my mouth a bunch of times before it ever came out. It wasn't that easy to say then. Certainly
Yeah.
not like it is now. And so if someone grew up without saying that, and it just may be a little awkward for them, one, kind of ask them, is there a barrier there? Is there something that we can
Mhm.
work on? And maybe help them by saying, hey, start where they're comfortable. If it's really hard for them to get those words out because of whatever, maybe you do a hand sign to start out
Mhm.
with, and kind of work towards the verbal part of it. But some way that you can figure out, how do we communicate in a way that, whether it's a signal or the words, and then how do we back that up with the way we live our life?
Yeah, that's so good. So that's just it's all about just like taking some steps forward wherever you are.
Yeah,
That's so good.
yeah, and it's not, if I don't want somebody to feel bad because I say that we say it all the time. That works for us, but what works
Mhm.
for you guys, and what is it's important. There's the And I've had a couple of people tell me this over the years. I think I first heard it as really kind of a joke, where the guy said, I told you I loved you on our wedding day, and if it changes,
Mhm.
I'll tell you. And
Right.
so, okay,
Right.
very practical. But I would guess that that person's wife would like to hear it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that just sounds like a comic strip, really, you know? It
Yeah,
doesn't sound like
exactly. But
not
I've
very yeah.
worked with people that I think that maybe they didn't verbalize it, was kind of their philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that's why I'm glad we're talking about this topic
Yes.
today.
Yes. Get
Yeah,
it on the table and talk about it.
exactly. Yeah. So, do you have any advice for the spouse who has good ideas but just doesn't act on them?
Well, if we're working somebody in counseling and they're talking about that, I would say, is that helping your marriage to have these
Hmm.
ideas and not acting them? Um,
Hmm.
I heard somebody talk one time. I can't remember who it was, but they talked about all the great ideas that people had over the years that never got past their mind. They never got
Hmm.
verbalized. They never got acted upon. And I think our pastor said something in a message a few years ago, and it really stuck with me. And he says, if you think something, and he was talking about, it was a marriage deal. If you think something good about your spouse,
Hmm.
say it. And I think sometimes we don't. And I think we need to say those things.
Hmm.
And if we have an idea of like, oh man, I know this would make Nancy feel loved, and I'm just lazy, or I just don't put the effort in, or not intentional, I don't do it. Well, I think I've missed an opportunity to
Hmm.
show her love in a way that I think that she would really receive it well. And so I think following through is important. If there's a barrier there that's keeping you from doing it, figure it out. If you have to
Hmm.
count, if you go to count, not have to go. If you go to counseling, counselor can help you figure it out. But those good ideas about what will make your marriage better and what will make your spouse more loved, if they never get out of your head,
Hmm.
then you might as well not even have them, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of like you're not having the same relationship that you want to be having in your mind, because if you have the ideas, it's something you're thinking about and something you're, entertaining. If you're not sharing that, then they don't even know. They'll never know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so
And I've
easy
been
to.
guilty of that before too. I've thought of something and then I get distracted. I don't do
Oh,
it,
yeah.
and I think, and maybe it was just a one to not lifetime, but the
Mhm.
moment had passed when that would
Mhm.
really have been a good thing to do. And then later I think, why didn't I do that? And just
Yeah.
um, trying to be more res- responsive when I have those thoughts and to act on them.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's easy to just think we'll have a million opportunities in marriage
Yeah,
because it can be so easy to take a spouse for granted because they're around, but that's not the case. I mean, you never get that opportunity again, that same one.
right, exactly.
So, okay, I'm curious about this, taking it into the practical as we talk about just making these things happen. Are there any favorite things Nancy has done for you that made you feel loved?
You know, one thing that Nancy did from the very first date we had, she is such a, she's so much gratitude. She says thank
Hmm.
you. She still says thank you for things that I do that I think I don't deserve a thank you for that. I mean, she says thank you all the time.
Hmm.
And so I love that about her. And it's made me think about that. And I think I said a lot more to her and to others than I used to in the past, just because I realized that's a really nice thing to say. And so it made me feel cared for and appreciated, maybe more in the early stages of our marriage, appreciated. Um, but now it's just like that she notices every little thing that I do, and she thanks me for it, and that's
Hmm.
just really special. That she takes
Hmm.
that's just part of who she is. I think she also is really good about knowing what I need and then doing it, and
Hmm.
some of that is because of being married as long as we have, and we know each other better, and we know a lot of what works and doesn't work. We're still learning, but sometimes she just seems to know what I need. And then, there's times that she just, the time that always has stood out to me is when my dad passed. And my dad was
Hmm.
so close to me. And I remember it was that afternoon, I think we'd been to the funeral home or something. I just came back and I lay in the bed, and I was just, this grief was coming over me. And all she did was come and she laid beside me and put her arm around me and until I got up. And she knew that I just needed her to
Hmm.
be there. I didn't need her to say anything. Didn't need her to do anything special. I just needed her to be there. And the more we can be intuitive, empathetic with our spouse, I think that really makes them feel loved. And then she does other
Hmm.
things. I mean, she knows my favorite meals. Uh, we laugh together a lot, and the
Hmm.
fact that we have can laugh together, that we have our own private jokes like most couples do. Those I think draw us together. Now that she enjoys touch more, that helps
Hmm.
a lot. We hold hands more. We do things like that. And I think another thing is that being a counselor, you would think it would be real easy for me to just talk about everything, but it's not always. And so,
Mhm.
if she has a real ability to know if something's bothering me, and she has a
Mhm.
great way of drawing things out of me. She's persistent in a loving way, and she
Mhm.
just won't let me off the hook. So I know, okay, once we start that conversation, she's going to get out. So the sooner the better. But if it's things that I need, and it helps me to get that out. And so, anyway, those are the things that kind of came to mind to start with. But you want to be able to, you want your spouse to be able to say those things about you.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
my spouse does things that make me feel loved, uh,
Mhm.
and so it's learning about what makes them feel loved and being consistent in doing it.
Yeah. I love that you shared those too, and that's why I wanted to hear them because I had the feeling it was gonna be small things, not, grand gestures, not huge
Yeah.
things, a lot of little things. Those are the things. One thing I love that makes me feel really loved, acts of service is one of my love languages, but it could be like what serves me on a different day might be very different. And so
Mm,
when Brian asked the question, how can I help you today? That just makes me feel loved because it's not like, oh, I have to do this chore for you. It's not something like that.
right.
It's just a little bit of empathy that helps. And it's really those small things done over time that bring that feeling. I
I
really like that.
Yeah, I love it. So if Brian asks you, what can he do to help you? I mean, yeah, he's showing caring, and and I think, and
Mhm.
then you're able, that he showed that he cared about you. He's not doing it like he has to.
Mhm.
And it's so different than if you ask him to do something, he goes, "Ugh,
Yeah.
I don't want to.
Yeah.
And then he does it. I mean, on
Yeah.
both things, he does it. But what a difference in how it makes you
Absolutely.
feel of
Mhm.
whether he's asking, initiating. You say, "Yeah, I'd love for you to do this," and he does it, as opposed to you
Mhm.
asking him and he grumbles through it, and you think, "Well,
Mhm.
he did it, but I don't know if I'll ask him anymore. I don't want to hear that grumbling."
Right. Right.
Same
Yeah,
end
for sure.
result, but a lot of different feelings and emotion that go along with it.
Completely different. Yeah, that makes such a huge difference. Yeah. And another thing, I mean, just speaking from a women's perspective, I don't think this is a love language, but just when he engages with our kids, that makes me feel so close to him. It's interesting because I don't know what you call that. I don't there need, I feel like that's a love language of its own for a parent, specifically for a mom, but there's something about that, engagement that makes me feel closer. And I wish I'd been able to put that into words better when we were earlier in parenting,
Mm.
but now I can. And so I think it just helps to see that as when there's this like intentional chosen interaction and engagement that just makes me feel so warm and fuzzy.
I've heard that from so many moms, and I think,
Mhm.
and I don't really know why. I think maybe it's just the way God wired us, but I think that's also something that every wife desires. They want
Mm.
their husband to be involved with the kids. They want their husband to take that initiative and to
Mhm.
enjoy the kids.
Mhm.
I think when I would play in the floor with the kids, I could just tell if Nancy was just sitting there, she just kind of have a smile on her face because she
Mhm.
loved seeing those things. And so,
Mhm.
um, no, that makes total sense. Absolutely.
Yeah, I wish there was a better name for it because I wish I'd heard it talked about earlier. But there is something about that. And wherever they are, wherever the kids are, I love that the dad is going to bring something totally different to it than the mom would. And so if he's interacting in a totally different way, that's cool too. I'm not going to wrestle with the boys in the same way Brian is. And I love that for
Right.
them. I'm not going to get involved. Do your thing, guys, but it's just really sweet.
Well, and I think you said it pays off. Both
Yeah.
husband and wife, mom and dad, both have to connect with the kids in those early years so that
Mhm.
it's easier to connect then in the tough years when they come, the middle school and high school years. And so,
Whew. Tell
I
me about
think,
it.
yeah. And if you just don't lay that groundwork, then it's harder it's hard, a lot easier to lay it when they're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old than it is when they're 13, 14, 15, 16.
Mm,
The
mhm,
groundwork needs to
mhm.
be like that. I mean, you can't do it when they get that age, but uh, certainly is a lot easier the sooner you did it and you keep that connection. I was talking to a mom not too long ago, and she and her husband both have such a great relationship with their kids. They're very open with them. They respond well. They listen to their kids when they say something, even if it's hard to hear them say it, and they don't overreact. And I just said, if you guys keep that up, the teenage years for your kids and you are going to be a lot easier. Not going to be perfect, but they're going to be a lot easier because you've established that communication, that relationship.
Yeah, that's so good. When I think that kind of reminds me of where we started with this, where, saying the words, I love you, it's not just the words, it's the context. And I think what we're kind of hitting on here is some relational context for, between two spouses, the things that are going on around us with our kids or whatever other relationships are going to impact, are going to play into, how we are experiencing each other. And so I think that's just a huge part of what might influence where we're coming from on any given day with each other.
Yeah, great.
So, Dr. Kim, this has been a really helpful conversation and encouraging. Do you have any final piece of advice for our listeners?
Well, the main thing I would hope people get out of that is to see that love really is a verb. It really is an action word. And so each day, if you just take the time to say, how can I show love to my spouse? How can I help my spouse feel loved? Most of the time, it doesn't take that much time or that much effort. Maybe sometimes it might if something different comes to your mind. But if you do that intentionally every day, it is amazing what you will see in your spouse. And if your spouse doesn't respond right off, just keep doing it. Just keep showing love to them. I think eventually it'll break through.
Yeah, that's so good. I think so too. That's a really encouraging place to land for today. And today, since we asked our anonymous question in the middle of the episode, that'll cover our anonymous question for today. But I will make sure we have links to our love cans, our 5 days, 5 ways love languages challenge, and the free 5 love languages YouVersion plan we have. All those will be in the show notes. So make sure you check wherever you're listening to the podcast for those notes. We also have a podcast email list, and that's where we put all the resources as well as application questions for every episode and all of the other bonus content that we might mention or might think would be just helpful for you. We'll put in scripture, quotes, different stuff as it's helpful. So look in the show notes and find the link to sign up for that today. As always, you can reach out to us at info@awesomemarriage.com with any questions or comments. We love hearing from you and answering any questions, so feel free to do that. Thanks for listening and sharing your time with us today. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.